Witching hour has arrived. Thank you very much for joining me today. I am very much looking forward to all of your questions. We had some interesting conversations going on within the chat box to be found within the LinkedIn event page. And so I am using that as a basis apart from some traditional questions that I usually get. But clearly, I do not want to leave this session based upon that of what I've heard so far. I consider you, or better said, you should consider yourself to be empowered to go ahead and ask me questions, because this is all for your benefit, and that's my take. And of course, the reward for me is being able to go ahead and help you. And for all of you LinkedIn Learning subscribers, it's a way for me to actually go ahead and say thank you, because I think that your patronage should not be taken for granted, but rather that we need to go ahead and express that. And so this is my opportunity as well. So I have put together a few slides, and I thought that especially the first subject that I'd like to go ahead and cover is something that I get questions on quite a bit. What I'll be doing is describing to you the difference between portfolio management, program management, and project management. As you could see on your screen right now, there's a diagram that it looks a little bit difficult to follow on the first glance. This is just to make sure that it's clear, that everybody is aware that the source of this diagram is coming from the Project Management Body of Knowledge, or PMBoK. And as you could see on the top, we have the portfolio. And the portfolio, according to the PMBoK definition, represents all projects, programs, and processes within an organization. So this role of a portfolio manager is very, very important. If you, and I know that this is a little bit difficult to read, so the intention is not to go ahead and focus too much on the written components of the slide, but rather to just use it as a bench, jumping off point, so to speak. And please feel free to go ahead and reach out to me if you're interested in getting a copy of any of these slides. The portfolio manager is responsible for making sure that the strategy of the organization is properly deployed. And that's why, if indeed there's a change to a strategy in an organization, it could have a clear effect on your programs and inevitably to your projects. So if we're looking at it from a hierarchy perspective, the portfolio manager is responsible for the entire enterprise. A program manager, for those of you who have actually had an opportunity to go ahead and take a look at the course that I have on LinkedIn Learning, are familiar with the concept of program management. But for those of you who are not familiar, a program manager is responsible for a collection of projects that are working towards the same benefits and collection of deliverables. So it could be, it's usually, well, it definitely has to be more than one project. A project can belong to a program, but doesn't have to. And so the goal of a program manager is to perform what's called benefits realization, and making sure that it's actually bringing value to the organization. What's the relationship to the portfolio? Well, the portfolio manager is making sure that the strategy is being managed. And so we would have strategic objectives. These will all be found within a program. And then lastly, you have your project, so responsible for actually taking care of creating the deliverables. And I know that that's a lot of information, but what I'll try to do on the next slides, and perhaps maybe if I can go ahead and change this view, you see me as well, because I'm actually going and want to make sure that the interaction is as much as possible with all of you. I have a few other slides that I plan to show here that will perhaps maybe bring all this into perspective. So first, let's go ahead and start with some basic comments. These are elements that I've also covered within the course, but I think it's always good to go ahead and revisit this. The vision of an organization is the why do we actually come in part. So what is the overall goal of the organization? and what we're striving for. It has nothing to do, certainly at the first glance, of something that's actually tangible, but rather has a very large goal that for the most part really shouldn't change. And the example that I give in my course is talking about Toyota, who talks about mobility. And I thought it was quite interesting when I started researching this subject many years ago. This was before we actually started with e-cars. They thought it was quite prescient for Toyota to look at the subject of mobility. People aren't looking for cars. They're looking to get from A to B. And so that's what Toyota has set as their goal. Now, when we go ahead and move towards the mission, well, the mission is the how do we get there part. What are we actually trying to achieve? And so if we stay with the example of Toyota, or it could be any car company, please don't get me wrong, I'm not giving a priority to Toyota, but they would most likely be focusing on e-cars, especially here in Europe. We have a directive that came out yesterday where we are looking to eliminate cars that are based on fossil fuels by the year 2035. And so that has to be a high priority for car companies. And then the strategy is how do we actually make it happen part. So the strategy are your tools that enable you to make sure that the mission is completed. And of course, all this has to be in alignment with the vision. And then you have your objectives, is how do you actually measure it? We have our organization that's responsible for making all that take place. And then lastly, we have tasks within the organization. So if you can imagine looking at this pyramid, we always need to ensure that the tasks that are actually being worked on within an organization are fulfilling the vision. So it should be very easy for anybody should be very easy for anybody in the organization to know why they're there and why they're doing what they're doing. Well, as we all know, this is not always so clear cut. But now I'd like to go ahead and show you how I envision all of this actually taking place within our portfolio, program, and project management world. So we have our vision, mission, strategy, objectives, organization, and tasks. And so what I've done is I've put the pyramid on top of this model. So we need to always make sure, is the portfolio in line? The vision should be pretty clear. Is it in line with the vision, the mission, and the strategy? If not, then we need to go ahead and change the components of our programs and projects. Same with the program, that there might be parts that will stay the same. That means you'll have projects that can continue, but there might be other parts that we'll need to go ahead and remove because it's no longer part of our strategy. And then, of course, the deliverables that a project manager is working on, that one's very clear. So I know that was a lot of information. I hope that brought some added value, especially looking at it from a vision, mission, strategy part. And so that was one question I get quite often. So I thought that would be a good way to start. And I've seen a lot of comments coming through the chat box. So I'm very, very appreciative here. Let me see if there's any questions that I would... Okay, let me go ahead and display this on the screen. This is coming from Renato. Thank you very much, Renato, first of all, for attending, and secondly, for your questions. What are the challenges expected from an IT portfolio manager? This is really funny, Renato, because you know what? That was one of my last jobs within being an employee. I was an IT portfolio manager. So I feel that I'm qualified to answer that question. What did I do? I needed to make sure that I understood the actual applications that we had within our portfolio, and to understand to what degree are they still part of our strategy. Very often, these are the problems that I had. We had duplicates, triplicates of all applications because there was no strategy, and everybody more or less went ahead and picked out their application. Which of course had all huge costs for us as an organization. We had to go ahead and support all of these applications. We needed to have space in a data center for them and the like. So part of it is, of course, is making sure that our organization was lean. So we needed to get rid of all of that. We needed to go ahead and standardize. And I needed to go ahead and make sure that the applications that we had within the portfolio, that of what I was actually responsible for, that it was in alignment with our strategy and our mission. Because if they were not, you have to go ahead and ask the question, why do we have it? So it doesn't necessarily mean that the application was bad, very possibly you might run across maybe some problems tied to your mission or your strategy because you say one thing, but your organization is doing something completely different. That's one I ran across quite a bit as well, Renato. And then, of course, there was all kinds of rationalization that I needed to go through. I needed to make sure that the money was being spent wisely. It's long. So for me, I'm a little bit biased. I think that the role of an IT portfolio manager clearly falls in line with all of these things that we've been talking about. So again, thank you very much for your question. Let me go ahead and move on. This is coming from Sukitra. I hope I didn't bastardize your name, sorry. How do you decide between a product and a program management? What skills to look for if certifications are required? Okay, thank you very much for that question. What I can do is go ahead and move to this view. The first part of your question is how do you decide between product and program management? They have different functions. So this is a pretty easy decision to make. A product is there to actually go ahead and support the strategy of the organization. Otherwise, we have to go ahead and ask the question, why do we even have the product? And part of the interesting part between a product, we could look at a program, but we could also look at it from a project level. This is something that we talk a lot about in project management. What is the difference between a product and a project? Well, a product is something that lives much longer than a project. A project, by definition, is something that has a beginning, middle, and an end, and it's all tied to transformation. So very possibly, and most probably, that you will have some sort of project to go ahead and get your product together. But once the product is already developed, well, then you can go ahead and bring it into operations, and then you will be following standard processes for the most part. Standard processes may be tied to releases, or very possibly, if you are working on a more agile level, there will be some certain processes that need to be followed, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a project anymore. And then, of course, a program, very possibly you might have different components to be found within the program that would be required for your project. That would be one way of actually looking at it. And then the skills that are required, yeah, I think product management is something that you need to be a very good communicator. Well, you do as a program manager as well, but it has everything to do with understanding what your customers are looking for, of course, depending on the product per se. Understanding, is it internal customers or are we talking about external customers? Are we able to go ahead and make sure that we bring additional advantages to our organization through this product? There's a number of things that we'd be looking at depending upon the actual product per se. And then from a program manager perspective, I think you have to have a thorough knowledge of all the ins and outs tied to projects for sure. And of course, those overlying components to be found within programs. As far as your question on the certification, a little bit difficult to answer on the product side because it really depends on which direction you're coming from. One in part of my world, which has been agile, you have a program manager's certification, but I don't feel that I'm qualified to actually go ahead and answer that question. Concerning the program manager, definitely there are different certification modes out there. We have Prince 2, we have IPMA very strong here in Europe. I tend to follow PMI, for better, for worse. And so I base my course on the program management body of knowledge. And so that was the basis by which I actually went ahead and put together my course. And that has served me quite well. Apart from my own, just referring to my own certifications, I'm also a certified portfolio manager, and I'm not quite sure where we stand on that from a PMI perspective, but I think we're still early days, although I've had mine for about 6 years, I believe. Yeah, so I hope that I was able to go ahead and answer your question. Let me see what else we have coming through. Here's another question here. What are the top integrated tool platforms for governance, oversight, dashboards, and ops review of a large portfolio of programs, each of which has its own set of projects? Okay, that's an assumption. Let's reverse engineer this question, that a portfolio is actually doesn't have to be, you don't have to necessarily have programs. You could have portfolios and go straight to projects as well. But I'll stay with this definition. Audience would be C-suite and top leadership. Okay, so the audience is C-suite. So that means that we're talking about high-level information. We don't want to belabor them with minutia. They don't want details. If we understand our stakeholders, they want to have a concise description of what's actually taking place, ideally real time. That would be one of my qualifications. And it should be very visible. And if it's C-suite, based on my experience, they want something that they could take and they can go ahead and use it for their own purposes. So in other words, if you have an application that's creating some sort of diagrams, that the possibility exists to go ahead and download the diagram so they can put it into a PowerPoint presentation or whatever application you might be using for this purpose, and so they can disseminate this information to perhaps the stakeholders or the shareholders, perhaps. So that would be one. I think when we're talking about governance, oversight, governance and oversight, it would be on a display level, making sure that we are adhering to it, depending upon the business. I mean, there are some sectors that are very key on compliance, so that would be a key one. The dashboards I already mentioned. As far as some suggestions on tools, I'm afraid that I am not the right person to go ahead and answer the question. I would have a good idea of what kind of requirements I would include in such an application, but it would require research to go ahead and answer that question properly. And I value your attendance here, and I don't want to go ahead and give a flippant answer. So I'm afraid I couldn't give you an actual suggestion tied to a tool, but I can tell you that in my mind, those would be the requirements that we would definitely need for such a tool. So thank you very much for your question there. Here's another question coming from Amul. We're hiring for a project manager role. Which are the top skills you look for in a person with no prior project management experience? Yes. I am looking for somebody who is very inquisitive and does not look at themselves as being a bureaucrat. In other words, somebody who wants to get something done, somebody who's very responsible, somebody who likes making sure that something's done properly, has to be an excellent communicator, because I personally believe that the most important quality of a project manager is managing her stakeholders. So in other words, who are the individuals following the definition of a stakeholder? Anyone who is positively or negatively affected by the endeavor that you're working on, the project. So can you go ahead and define who the stakeholders are? Can you go ahead and classify your stakeholders? Can you figure out ways to get information from your stakeholders in the form of requirements? Either you're doing it yourself, or possibly you might have a business analyst on board. These are qualifications, or better said, these are capabilities that have nothing to do with knowledge or certification. And I really like this question, because I think that this is exactly where we need to start. We need to make sure that we have the right people doing the job. You could teach them anything if they want to learn. They can spend the time to get the certifications later on. But if they do not have the proper mindsets and the proper capabilities to go ahead and do the job properly, you're all wasting your time. So these would be some of my suggestions. I hope that brought you some added value, and I really appreciate that question. Thank you very much for that. Let's go on to another question from Ahmad. To have a portfolio or a program manager from PMI, you have to be very experienced in this loop. Yes, I wouldn't be able to give you the exact figures, or I can try to come up with the exact figures. Oh, I think for the portfolio manager, you needed to have at least 7 years experience, if not even more. They usually equate this to months. It's been a while since I actually looked at the qualifications, but it's something along those lines. For a I think for a project, you have to have at least 3,500 or 4,000 months. That would be too much. 3,500, 35, 40 months of experience. You have to have a number of months experience regardless. And within the testing, they'll go ahead and make sure that the experience that you have, and I think it's really important for those of you who have not gone ahead and gone through the certification. This is something I remember quite distinctly from PMI. They will go ahead and make sure that the experience that you have, the experience you put down on your application, is actually matching that of what is to be found in the PMBoK, because they are trying to find out whether you first of all, they're trying to find out, do you understand the PMBoK? That's the first question. And the second part of this, they want to make sure that your experience is relevant. So that's something they're really looking for. As far as the actual conundrum that you're referring to, that you need to have experience to get hired, I think I'd like to go back to the previous question and try to figure out ways that you can get experience. And obviously, I understand this is very difficult depending upon your culture, and I'm very, very much colored from my original culture, that being the United States, where we feel that if we want to do something, we can go ahead and show people that we're capable. I wish I had a good answer to this. I think this is a serious problem. And I think that if it was me in that situation, I would try to go ahead and convince them. I would sell them that I'm the right person regardless. And I think that that's doable. You just have to show people that you want it as much. And I'm a little bit deviating, but I think it's a really important point. I was a manager for a number of years. And that meant I had to go ahead and hire people. And I decided to actually go ahead and start from the ground level, come up with people that had the right capabilities in my mind and were hungry, really wanted to do something. They had a good idea of what they were trying to accomplish, and they were willing to go ahead and work at it. And I've noticed, this is my personal experience, that those people are the ones that kind of skyrocket. They are the ones who are able to go ahead and manage their own career. So let's go back to this example. So you have certifications, but if you don't fulfill all the other requirements that I would go ahead and push, then you bring me no added value. So if it was me, I'd go ahead and try to push it that way and show people why they should hire you, and you need to do your homework and make sure that you go ahead and supply the company's needs. On the one hand, you did your homework, and you show them how you can actually go ahead and help them, and then put them on the spotlight and say, so why are you not interested in that? So some food for thought for all of you. I already see it right now. I'm not going to be able to get to all the other questions. That's quite all right. This is the first time that I'm performing this exercise, and I see that it is bringing out a value because you're coming up with questions. And two things. I'm going to try to make this more of a reoccurring event. So that means if I'm not able to go ahead and give you an answer online, let me go ahead and move this, get this out. Sorry, there we go. I have an event planned for August, which I will go ahead and announce at the end. But this is really great. That means there's a clear demand for this type of interaction. And so what I would like to do, and I'd be keen on your feedback, and I think you're already giving it to me right now, then I'll make this more of a reoccurring event. And for me, it'd be fine to do it, say, for example, once a month, simply because, and maybe make it a little bit more specific. That was a very broad subject. Maybe just concentrate on one specific thing. I will rely upon your questions as a barometer to better understand what are your needs and how I can best go ahead and fulfill them, right? So let me go ahead. Then the second part would be that I will, even if I'm not able to go ahead and answer them online, I'm going to try to see if I can capture all of this data and make sure that everybody gets an answer, because you took the time to go ahead and attend today. You took the time to go ahead and think about the question. You took the time to actually go ahead and write it down. So I need to find the time to give you an answer, and that's a promise. So let's see. Let's go ahead and move on to Mariana. let's say I ended up kind of by chance in a PM very varied position. Okay. Yeah, I understand that one quite well. We are confronted with a situation, and you're then put in the situation to go ahead and be a project manager. Okay, small company in the academic field where the role is unclear and very broad. Welcome to project management in Europe. And I've been working for less than 3 years. Okay. What questions would you ask to know if it is worth deepening the learning of PM skills? Oh, I love this question too. Certifications, is to say, is the role, the way to follow. And here's something that I could definitely sympathize with you. I think virtually throughout my entire career, it was learning by doing. I never really had anybody that I can consider to be a mentor. Certainly there was no regimented training along these lines that was being promoted for the organizations that I worked for. And so if indeed I wanted to learn something, I went ahead and did it on my own. And I bet you, Mariana, this sounds very familiar. And they got to a point of where I went ahead and decided that it's worth it for me. This is really getting to your question. It was worth it for me to actually go ahead and make this my career. I actually enjoy this, and I felt that there were certain capabilities that I have that I was able to go ahead and make a difference. And then I started to go ahead and make the deep dive. Not only with just project management, I was involved with business analysis for a number of years. And here in Europe, very often you're performing both within a project. And the most unfortunate part, and here I'm really getting to the crux of your question, I believe, I learned how I could have made my life so much easier had I gone ahead and said, so what is the theory tied to this profession? So if I can make a general suggestion to all of you, then even if you do not feel that you have enough experience to go ahead and get yourself certified, although with PMI, and please don't get me wrong, I'm not pushing PMI. Believe you me, I'm not pushing PMI. But they do offer an associate project management to give the other organizations an opportunity here too. I'm not quite sure about Prince 2, but I know IPMA offers a very junior position tied to project management. So there might be a solution where you do not need to go ahead and have all those years of experience to get the top certification, but you would have something that you can show. And I believe that there's a lot to be said about the theory of project management. Maybe if I could just add something else, and I already see that I'm not diverting. I think this is all very important stuff. You know, we talk about body of knowledge, and we talk about, let me go ahead and remove this. We talk about body of knowledge, and very often people within the organization will say, but that doesn't apply to us. And they don't quite get the message that a body of knowledge is a framework, and a framework is a collection of best practice. So that, you know, within best practice, it doesn't necessarily mean that all of it applies to the project or the program that or even the portfolio that you're working on. But the fact is, if you're trying to go ahead and make sure that you have a professional organization, that at least you should be trying to strive towards these best practices. And that's what I really do like about these models, because it allows you to go ahead and say, this is a benchmark that we as an organization should actually be striving for. And so I think that it's something that should be something that we should all be working on early in our careers than later. And I use myself as an example, because in retrospect, I would have really appreciated had somebody said, why don't you go ahead and start looking at this stuff, because it could be to your benefit. And even if I didn't understand at the beginning, I think I probably would have gotten to that point a little bit earlier. So again, Mariana, thank you very much for that question. There's another one. As a fresher applying for engineering project management roles, what kind of internships roles should I try to gain before applying? Engineering and project management for me are two completely separate things. I mean, you could be a project manager within an engineering field, and I suspect that's probably what you're referring to here. I think anytime you can actually be an assistant to a seasoned project manager, I think it would be good. And the idea, this is how I would go into it. I would look to find somebody who you feel really, if you have the opportunity, of course, that you really feel that is top notch. You get the impression they know what they're doing. They have a certain command of the situation. They are treated with respect, and they want to get something done. And so you can learn a lot from a person like that, and figure out a way to get in touch with this person and say, how can I go ahead and help you? Because I think anything I learn along the ways will only be to my benefit. And if you can do that on an unofficial way, I think would be a good thing. That's probably where I start. Obviously, the suggestions I'm giving you may or may not work in the areas where you're working at right now, and I think cultural elements play a certain role as well. But I think that would be the approach I take, and I think it's certainly worth a try, right? So let's go ahead and move down. This one's coming from Heather. Brendan Heinrichs, that the majority of my background is BA and tech BA roles. Okay, so I could definitely go ahead and sympathize with you on that, because that's something that I did for a number of years. When I applied for the PMI, I used my experience and was accepted as to meeting the PMI requirements. Congratulations on that. Most of my business analyst experience was leading projects or enhancement work with no PMs. Yes, it's something I mentioned earlier, where we are very often, especially here in Europe, we're wearing multiple hats. And I know that for North Americans, sometimes it's a little bit difficult to understand that you would have one person who's doing like 5 different roles. And I personally believe that's not really healthy for an organization, because it inevitably, and I'll keep this one short, the classic example of conflict for a project manager who's a BA at the same time, you're behind in your requirements, and then you have to go ahead and make a value judgment. Do I do a fast track on my requirements to make sure that my project stays on track? Knowing full well that if we have shoddy requirements, then very possibly we will have shoddy deliverables, and so that's a bit of an issue. So I had to take on the PM function. I highlighted that on my resume and applications. I hope that helps. Yes, of course, I understand that one very well, and I still wonder within organizations what the actual knowledge and the respect and the accolades to be given to a project manager, how high they are. And I know from doing some corporate training for different multinationals, you find out very soon what kind of maturity they have, and just talking to the individuals. And I think we have a long ways to go. And so, yeah, that sounds like something I would have done. So congratulations to that. Wonderful. Okay, this question coming from Ali. What is the main responsibility? I'm going to assume POM is a product manager. I'm not quite sure, because it could be maybe portfolio manager. I'll go ahead and give you an answer for portfolio manager, and you can always come back to me and let me know if I picked out the right one. Yeah, a portfolio manager. Yeah, it has to be portfolio manager. A portfolio manager is the person who is actually very closely aligned with the C-suite. If you ask me, they have to be reporting to somebody within the C level of an organization, whatever that may look like within the organization that you're working for. And they are clearly responsible for making sure that the strategy, and this would, if I'm putting it down to something very basic, they're responsible for making sure that the strategy of the organization is actually being adhered to throughout the entire organization. So that refers to, of course, the various programs that are being run, the projects of themselves, within the PMI definition, we're also looking at operations, so that all of the processes taking place within the organization, and then the corresponding tasks. Because if you think about it, a strategy. Let's take Corona as an example. We needed to go ahead and change our strategy, or a number of companies needed to go ahead and change their strategy like this. So that means that you need to have an organization who is able to go ahead and adapt based upon the changes of your strategy. Well, it's going to be the portfolio manager who's really responsible for making sure that that's being adhered to throughout the entire organization. Now, can you imagine? I know this one from personal experience. There's nothing worse that if something's happening up in the organization, think about that triangle, the pyramid that I showed you earlier. If something's happening upstairs and if the information is not being brought downstairs, that very possibly you change your strategy and it's being subverted by your processes every day. And I kid you not, I've seen that too often throughout my entire career, because nobody took the time to explain to the rest of the people in the organization that our strategy changed, and that means your processes need to change, or your project needs to change, or your project's no longer relevant, or we need to go ahead and define new benefits for our program. So this position of a portfolio manager, in my opinion, is extremely important, and I have the sneaky feeling that we're still not far along in understanding the importance within an organization. So thank you very much for that question. Let's go here to see it. I have done PMP. What should I do now? Program. Ooh, that's a difficult question to answer, because it's based upon something that has nothing to do with programs or portfolio. It has everything to do with what you want to do in your career. And I'm going to give you another example for myself, because I think examples are the most relevant. I know this stuff really well. I've spent too many years in and I still enjoy the subject, as you can see, but my tasks today are in a very different direction. So give yourself the opportunity to go ahead and say that, life is long and you could do a bunch of different things. Maybe go ahead and take a look from a different perspective and say, so where do I see myself in maybe 5 years time, 10 years time, and not necessarily just from a career perspective, but from a life perspective, and say, what kind of life do I want to have? And are the things that I'm working on now, do they help me get to that point of where I'm trying to take things? That would be the question I'd be answering. And I'm sorry if I kind of deflected from your original question, but I think that's very important. I am now on the 5th leg of my career, and a lot of it has come over the last less than 10 years. No, I'd say 10 years. The last 10 years have been very pivotal, and I've made a number of changes, including moving into academia, which I could have never imagined. And it's because I didn't plan it, and I saw opportunities, and I knew where I was trying to make a difference, that these things happen. So I hope I came close to answer your question. Apologies for that. So let's go ahead and move on. My company has a PMO, and it's good that thank you for PMO, because I wanted to talk about PMOs as well. And clients have enterprise PMOs. How do you manage expectations between these two entities to minimize heavy processes, ensuring that PM performance management metrics produce quality? Well, I think the first question, when we talk about project management offices, there are different flavors. And of course, here in the example that you give, there's already also an enterprise PMO. The first question I might go ahead and ask, why do you have two? Why couldn't you go ahead and have the project management part? And that could have been simply projects, could be tied to programs. We also have portfolio management offices as well. So a PMO could be anything. It's really only one organization, the enterprise. So why do you have two? Could be a source of conflict. Maybe the thoughts are to take it in a different direction. Yeah, I think there's a real danger of having a lot of bureaucracy or a lot of compliance, simply because I think by your question, you're already implying that the reason why we have these organizations is for compliance or adherence within the organization. So maybe the problem might even be somewhere else, that you you don't have enough faith in the individuals you have in your organization. I'm making some general assumptions, and I probably should leave it at that. I think, you know what I would do? I would go back to that pyramid, the pyramid that I showed you earlier, and ask them some clear-cut questions. So why are we here? What are we trying to achieve? How do we plan to do it? And how is it going to be measured? Those would be the four elements: the vision, the mission, the strategy, and the objectives. And then try to go ahead and map them to everything that's taking place there, because if indeed they do not add to the bottom line of those four components, then you have to ask yourself as an organization, why are we doing it? It's a waste of time, and we have limited resources, not just from cash, but also from employees. We need to go ahead and make sure that something much more productive is coming out of it. And so I hope I didn't go ahead and go too much in a direction, but I think if it was me, and I'm very, as you could tell, I'm sure it's very prevalent, that I call it as I see it. And I think that if we want to get something solved, then we need to be able to go ahead and address the issues properly. So I hope that answered your questions, or came a little bit closer. Here's another question. What would you advise a PMP who occupies an administrative role on a project and is not motivated? Especially knowing that she works in an environment where the organization does not implement projects using best PM practices. Oh, I think this applies to this particular situation, applies to a lot of people, not necessarily always tied to project management. Yeah, it's a real frustrating, isn't it? I know this one. I know this one as well. It's really frustrating when you're striving towards excellence and nobody understands what you're trying to do. And in all honesty, there are two paths. Either you feel that you have the ability to go ahead and change things within your organization, or you look in a different direction. And here again, I'm speaking from personal experience, and I guess it's kind of almost like an act of contrition for all, with all of you, that I probably waited too long in a number of situations simply because it was too comfortable. And I'm just being very honest. It was just too comfortable. And I wish that confrontation would have come earlier, because that would have forced me to actually go ahead and work towards my own best interest. As I mentioned earlier, that's something that I decided to change about 10 years ago, and I haven't stopped. And I don't regret anything, but I think that I probably would have been at this point that I am now much earlier had I gone ahead and taken that jump. But it's very difficult when you, for the most part, it's a pretty easy job. You're getting paid okay. There are other things you like, your colleagues. There are so many other reasons why you actually do a job. But eventually we have to say what's in our own best interest. So I don't know if I answered your question, Aniki, but I gave you a clear picture of situation that I've been in myself, and I clearly sympathize with that. And thank you very much for sharing the question with us. Okay, let's move on to Vivian. I've just obtained my CAPM a few months ago. Congratulations. I've managed projects on a scale for over 5 years. I'm not ready to manage large-scale projects yet, and we can always take this one offline. Why? Is it a case of where you're afraid that you do not have enough knowledge? So then the question is there ever going to be a good time? Can you figure out ways to move towards larger projects without having to maybe take on all of the responsibility, figure out like a roadmap to get there? That's what I would hope for you. Is there such a thing as a junior project manager role? It depends on the organization, or an associate PM role that isn't glorified. That really depends on the organization, because we use all of these terms. We talk about different types of positions within organizations. And when I let's go back to the example I started this live stream with, when I started talking about what a portfolio manager is, what a program manager is, what a project manager is. Now, these definitions could look completely different depending upon your organization. I've seen this way too often. just piggybacking on your point, which is very, very valid, that they'll go ahead and say you're a junior PM, which means you're a flunky. You're supposed to go ahead or a gopher. You're supposed to go ahead and just complete all of the dirty work for somebody else. And that's no fun. And that doesn't help you at all. So the real question is not necessarily these titles. That's my suggestion. Find out how these companies take. And I think it's your right to be very assertive and saying that this is what you want. And again, going back to the example I gave you earlier, being a manager, I like people who told me what they want, because that means they cared. And those are the people that I wanted working for me. I wanted people who cared. So yeah, I would really go ahead and be very direct and make sure that position that you're talking about, that you get an opportunity to do things hands-on, which is really what we're talking about. And I wish you the best of luck with that one, Vivian. Okay, let's go on, move on to Ashok. Thank you for updating with the great knowledge. Well, I try. Thank you very much for the compliment. Friendly questions. What is more important throughout the project? Completing the project on time, within budget and quality output, or adhering to project processes and not meeting the objectives? I'm going to add a third one to this one, Ashok. Does your project bring value? Because if your project doesn't bring value, why are you doing it? And this is a question. Oh man, this is my whole career in project management. Not quite the whole career, but it's very often. We will go, I don't know how many projects where we threw good money after bad, simply because we said it's what we call the sunk cost fallacy. And the sunk cost fallacy basically is where you say, we've spent so much money so far, we can't stop now. But what we don't realize is everything we did yesterday, if it brought no value, it's not going to bring any value today. If you're lucky, you can salvage it, but there is no guarantee. But everything you could do today, moving forward, that's something that you can definitely influence. So I always think, and I'm partially putting on my agile cap, because that's really where we make the difference, and not looking at it from, oh, I wish there's a slide I can show you. Maybe the next time I'll go ahead and pull this one out, where we remove scope for value, because then it's no longer the theory of constraints. And for those of you who are familiar with the theory of constraints, it's a triangle where you have the scope, you have time, and you have cost. And this directly relates to your question, Ashok. Now, if we are able to decouple the dependency between all of these three elements, that's really important. Now, try this one out for size. Oh, I think I have your answer. Try this one out for size. Try to put that within the theory of constraints, remove the word scope, and replace it with value. And so then you ask the question, would you pay this much money to get this value? Would you take this much time to get this value? Because if the answer is no, you have the answer to your question. You have the answer to your question. Let's go ahead and move on. What are the effective communication strategies in getting key stakeholders to perform desired actions? Oh, this is a great question. And oh, you have wonderful questions. I really love these questions. In getting key stakeholders to perform desired actions for your project in a fully remote working organization. Well, you know, I live in Vienna, Austria. And it's a wonderful country. I love living here. But most of the projects I worked on were based somewhere else. And that meant that I was very often confronted precisely with this remote working organizations. I think your question takes on a couple different components. How do we work virtually? And I thought it was quite interesting that this is all of a sudden, because of Corona, we're started talking about this, because this is a condition that we've been dealing with for a long time. Case in point, I've been working virtually for 20 years. I've managed teams, and I'm not trying to pat myself in the back, I'm only giving it as an example, managed teams where none of the people were sitting with me in an office. So that meant that by nature, I needed to figure out ways to get in touch with these people. That meant a lot of communication. I spent a lot of time on the phone. Back then, it was only phone. I needed to go ahead and build relationships. You need to be able to figure out who you can trust without actually meeting them. These are the prerequisites. And you need to, I think, networking. Let's do two things here. Let's go through the various steps tied to stakeholder management, and let's see if I can give you some examples of how to apply it. That might be the best way of looking at this one. So following the traditional path, giving you the definition I mentioned earlier. A stakeholder is somebody who is positively or negatively affected by the endeavor that you're dealing with. Doesn't always have to be a project. It could be anything. And so can you go ahead and list your stakeholders? And of course, it's always a case where you think you have the list and all of a sudden you find out there are new stakeholders, but don't be deterred. Can we go ahead and list them? Can we go ahead and put them into categories? And then some of the tools that I like using is a power interest grid. I really like using a power interest grid. What you do is you set up a matrix, and perhaps maybe I can come up with slides the next time for these sort of things as well. You go ahead and create a matrix, and you have power over on the left-hand side. So let's do it on the screen, left-hand side. And you have the interest on the y-axis. And so the idea is, can you go ahead and place your stakeholders on this matrix with the intention, depending upon where they fall within the matrix, you can come up with different strategies. And look at the ones that are important for you, those that have high power and high interest. Make sure that you have people in the organization that can help you in making sure that you have your stakeholders stay on board. One of the problems always is, where do we come up with this information? Very often we'll use an org chart, an organizational chart, which may or may not show the influencers of an organization. This has always been the pitfall that I've run across, because there'll be people with power, but it's not based upon title, but rather because they are the go-to individuals within your organization. So can you go ahead and find out who they are? I would really go ahead and try to talk to people that have been around the organization for a long time, and build up a friendship with them and figure out ways to how you can help them. And make sure that you have enough friends out there that if something goes wrong, that they will take the time to go ahead and inform you. And that's probably the best suggestion I can give you, regardless of whether it's a remote team or not. Hope that brought some added value too. In any case, thanks for the question. Let's see. Okay. I want to make sure, I kind of jumped around. I'm taking a quick look to see if they have anything else. I don't think I get to this question from Joydeep. Based on your reply on what you would look for in a project manager hire, are you saying anyone with those qualities you spoke about without prior relevant experience would be successful? They might not have the interest. You know, we have a lot of capabilities. We have a lot more than we give ourselves credit for. The problem is that very often we've gone through conditioning and we think this is all we can do. But, you know, as kids, we do all kinds of stuff and we have all kinds of interest. So it's possible that they have the capabilities, but they don't have the interest to go ahead and pursue it. So that might be part of it. And I think part of it is being hungry and wanting to make a difference in their own career. Those are the things I always look for. I disagree because you can't ask any medical professional to, okay, yeah, well, I'm not talking about, yes, I agree wholeheartedly. You need a certain amount of experience to go ahead and perform that. I'm looking specifically along these points tied to organization. And I'm not saying you should throw people straight into the fire, but rather these are the people that you can develop. And the fact is, if you have people that have all the qualifications but really don't have the characteristics to do the work, then they've very often been waste of space. And I'll go ahead and go a little bit further with your comment, because there are good medical practitioners and there are not good medical practitioners. And so I always try to strive towards excellence, meaning that I want to be with people who are also striving towards excellence. So yes, I agree. You cannot just go ahead and put them in, nor could you put somebody with no project management experience into a project. I know companies do that, but you shouldn't. You should let them go ahead and develop things and be mentored by an experienced project manager. That would be my suggestion. Sometimes we're given that opportunity, sometimes we're not. I know I often have not been given that opportunity, but okay. Um, don't know if that answered your questions, but in any case, I appreciate I appreciate your question. Thank you very much for that. So let's see where we're going. I think I might have gotten everybody here. I'm just going back to the top. We already went through this one. Okay, I don't think I get to this one, Amit. So let me go ahead and address that one. What can we do when principal project management or management is not working the way that it should be? Very often the case. We talked about that enough today. Specifically, a task associated people related part. How should a portfolio manager overcome this issue? I don't think it's necessarily a portfolio manager. I think it's anybody within an organization who holds responsibility, who should be able to go ahead and speak in a frank and honest manner. And there's always a choice that we need to make. We might not always have this luxury, and I will grant you, any of you who will say, "Oh, Mike, you can speak very easy about this subject." I am not in a position to go ahead and risk my career or risk my position to be so forthright. And I would never go ahead and criticize anybody for that. That being said, if it's me as a manager and I see that people are disgruntled, and I've run across this one enough, if I see that people are disgruntled, then I really have to wonder if this is the organization that I want to stay with. And I've been in situations where it wasn't that way, but it became that way, and then I knew it was time to leave. And a portfolio manager, I think, can only take it on from a very professional perspective and perhaps give some moral guidance to people lower in the organization. And in spite of everything that you're the person who actually goes ahead and motivates them. It's not really the way that you want to do things, but it would be a lie for me to say I never was in that situation, although I was not de facto the person responsible, but I took the responsibility because I knew that was the only way that we were going to make progress, and secondly, that I work with people that wanted to make a difference, and that meant that I took the time to actually go ahead and motivate them. I think that it's a little bit difficult to answer without knowing all the details, but I think it's a question of motivation. And can you be that motivator for the people? And then eventually, if you say that the company doesn't appreciate it, then you have to think things through. So let me just go ahead and I believe that I've answered all the questions. Let me see if there's any more. No, I did come up with some more. What are effective communication strategies in getting key stakeholders to perform desired actions for your project? Oh, no, we already covered this one. Apologies. And let's see, this is Ahmed. How do you go between shining the plate in a project and taking care of your stakeholders? Really two separate actions. Stakeholder management is, and if we go by the adage, and I think this applies to, doesn't matter what you do, whether it's a portfolio or a program or a project, that it's all about 80-90% is communication, and the people that you communicate with are your stakeholders. So everything you do is really stakeholder management. So that's part of the equation. Of course, of those stakeholders, the stakeholders that we're actually looking at, that we're going to have a number of them that are actually part of your team or part of teams. So give you a couple of examples. Didn't specify whether it's a project or a program or portfolio, but it doesn't matter. I'll give you examples for all of them. So if you're a project manager, then that means that your team members are going to be stakeholders. So it's a question of how do you go ahead and manage them? And of course, the approach that you take in managing your team members is going to be different, of course, depending upon who the stakeholders are. And you need to have a communication strategy. This is a big component of all of the certifications, and I agree with this one wholeheartedly. You have to understand your stakeholders, and you have to figure out how do you communicate with them and what communication works for them, not necessarily for you, but you always have to be focused on your stakeholders. And then, of course, if we look at the different types of communication, maybe using this as an example, we have direct and indirect, or sort of formal or informal, and well, we have actually both direct and indirect, formal, informal. And so the team members should be actually very informal and be able to get into facts. And you need to get them to the point of where if something's going wrong, that you don't have to find it out, because that's the biggest way to avoid trust. And then on the other side, making sure that you're understanding what your stakeholder needs are and how do you go ahead and relay that information. And I think part of it, if you're having difficulties, depending upon whatever the difficulty is, if you cannot manage the team, then you don't go to your superior and say, this team leaves something to be desired, because it was your responsibility. But if it's a case of where you're having problems with suppliers, maybe bring the stakeholders into the experience. Very often I would go to if I had a competent executive sponsor, go to that person and say, I need your help in getting certain stakeholders on board. And I think that's their role. Yeah, it's always a balancing act. So it's to summarize, I think that we're talking about two separate things. I think we're talking about overall stakeholder management and how you understand your stakeholders and make sure the communication befits those stakeholders, and then making sure that the team delivers. So I hope that brought some added value. And I see that we have one last question. I think that will close it today. We've been covering this for an hour. The slides that I had prepared didn't really get that far, but that meant that there was a huge demand for questions. So that was really good. How do you make the one project really finish on time and don't be endless with Agile? Well, the question is, what is done? And this is a great segue, because the next session that I'll be doing is, but first let me answer your question, then I'll go ahead and close. How do you make sure it's really finished? It's all tied to definition of done. If we cannot define what done is, then we're never done, right? So Agile does not mean endless. Agile means that we have defined for this particular element, this is done, and basically we're finished, and it's not something that necessarily has to be continued forever, not by a long shot. And so I think partially we're talking about how do we define Agile, and what is Agile supposed to actually accomplish, and how do we define on time?